So we have Jessica Watkins, who is in the Department of Teaching and Learning in Science Education. She's going to describe approaches that she found helpful for promoting small group work and effective preparation in an online course that had both graduate students and upper level undergraduates.
Hi, well, thank you so much for having me. So I am an assistant professor of science education at Peabody. And this fall, I taught a small course. So I'm going to say that this is only about 6 students. But I do have taught larger courses in online. So I'll kind of talk about how I made modifications from small to maybe a larger course and how that might work. And I'll probably show some of my students' work, but I took off all their names so I can share a little bit of what I did to help prepare for this. I will say, one thing that I found particularly challenging, even with 6 students, is that whole class discussion can be really challenging to get going. There's something about having to unmute and the awkwardness of knowing when to do that. So it took a lot of preparation and forethought into thinking about how can I make sure that these conversations can get flowing, because that's where we do a lot of our deep learning in my course. The course it's about developing or understanding how students develop science literacy. So it's for pre-service teachers. So we're actually doing a lot of meta talk about how to do teaching in there too. So that's actually kind of helpful in reflecting on your practice with them. So a couple of the strategies, just to get concrete. I had a reading every week, and I used Perusall. I'm not going to talk about that because there's plenty of resources around that to help get the conversation started. But I found that to be really helpful in thinking for me in planning the kinds of questions that I want to ask by seeing what are the things that they're noticing and where do I want to help deepen their thinking. But in addition to that, a lot of the questions that I would prepare for, say, in an in-person class, the kind of conversation pieces, I would actually have them do some of that thinking either through, I used Google Drive a ton, through Jamboards or slides, or sometimes I would even pair them up to work together on these things after the readings ahead of time. So I'm going to share a couple of those just to get a chance to see. I feel like listening to me talk is one thing, but getting to see what the students did can be really fun too. So for the early on, this was an early assignment that I had them do, is they read about cognitive science and science education. And it's a really dense article that talks about different theories of learning. So I asked them before class to come up with a model somehow for what they thought the author meant by strong restructuring or weak restructuring. And I gave them an example. And I asked them to include their name and then have that be a way to structure the small group conversations later. So they each came up with their own example, and you can see they're pretty different, but this gave them something concrete so that when they were in small groups, that they could be able to compare and contrast, like, why did you draw this? Or why did you make this? And how does this connect to my understanding of what I did? So it was a nice tool to structure that small group that in terms of like getting in, sometimes they're like, what do I do? This gave them like an artifact, something they can look at together and kind of explain to one another as a way to ease into. So this was early in the semester before they really knew each other, that they can be able to talk and think about that. So that was one activity that I thought was helpful for small group. I also used a lot of Jamboards. Can you all see the Jamboard now? Okay, I wasn't sure if it switched quickly. To get conversations going. I think that there was a lot of Post-it notes. And for some of them, this one was a long one where they had a lot to say. But it was another way to start thinking about, like, what are the benefits of translanguaging in this paper, or what questions are still lingering that didn't necessarily come up in Perusall, but gave them a chance to be able to read and think about that. So I found those Jamboards as a nice way to be able to get them thinking, get those ideas out ahead of time. And in a more synthesis-y way than you would get in through Perusall comments. And then lastly, some of the articles were more challenging. So we did talk about race and racism in the class, especially related to science. And I found that doing that over Zoom, it's really hard. You have to have a lot of political trust to be able to have those conversations. So one thing that I did for the students is, instead of asking them to do a Jamboard where everything's out in the open ahead of time, is I gave them a tool that they could use individually, and that would help them. So I did a lot of the summary instead of asking them to do the summary, and then ask them to sort of jot down their examples and share them with me privately ahead of time. And this was a way that I can help scope, like, where are there potential areas that I want to push? Where are some some tensions that might emerge, and helping me prepare for this question, these kind of conversations on Zoom. And so I learned a lot of that from going through a lot of different trainings from the CFT, but also from my department around thinking about how do we start surfacing some of these conversations and digging in ways. And doing that over Zoom seemed like a particularly big challenge. And so I wanted to make sure that I was aware of what students are going to be saying and what the kind of ideas that they might be bringing up, so I can make sure that that conversation was going smoothly while also supporting students' learning and trying to create a productive and brave space for them. So that's kind of my first beginning part of thinking about, like, what are some of the structures that I put in place to help facilitate some of that, like, what did I need to have in place to get things going in the classroom? But then the question is, what do you do in the classroom when it's actually ongoing? So there's the whole class conversation where I can get to listen and I get to hear. One thing I did was chat blasts, which you may have heard of. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second. So not that I can see, that way I can see at least names. I did chat blast, which is basically you ask students to write some idea. Like if I had this moment, I'm like, I really want to hear what everybody's thinking right about this idea right now. And I give them a few minutes and they can write it in the chat, and about a question, they write it in the chat, and then everybody presses enter at once. And I always found that to be really fun to be able to see all the different ideas. One thing they told me though that was really important for them is that if the professor didn't go through those ideas, that it kind of felt they didn't really see the point. So it was really important to not just have them do that and then not go through and kind of make connections between how people are thinking. So what I do when I have a larger group, so with 6 students, it's really easy to go through. But if you have a larger group to do that, that can be really challenging to be able to see. So I'm thinking medium size now. I'm not Kathy and Thomas. I'll let them think about big sizes. But for a group of, like, say 15 or 20, I don't think I would do chat blasts. I'm going to use Jamboards in that way. And it has the same idea, but then you can move ideas around. Like, where do you see, it's a nice way to kind of visually group different ideas and how different people are thinking about things and be able to draw connections across that you can't do through the chat. So that's my big suggestion for thinking about how to engage the whole class in a way. I can do that. My last thing is then in small groups. One of the big challenges in small groups, like when you're in person and you go in small groups, you can kind of like, what are they doing over there? What are their ideas? You can kind of listen without interfering. The big challenge in small groups or breakout groups is as soon as you show up, they're like, uh-oh, she's here. And you can kind of stop the conversation, or you have to you interrupt it in some ways. And you can't do this kind of, I kind of want to know where you are in this moment. So one thing I found really useful is to have them do a task that I can monitor, like, and I'll show you an example in a second, that I can monitor without having to enter the breakout rooms. And so now I'll share my screen again. I'll do this one, because this one was actually really fun to watch as they were drawing arrows. So this prompt that I had given them was to start to make connections between ideas. So I can imagine this for different concept maps, like asking them, how do they see, this was like the different articles we'd read. These were the kinds of big ideas that they had discussed learning. And these were the different other activities we had done. And I'd ask them to see, like, where do you see connections across these? Like, how are you seeing these things as connecting? And what was really cool was that I got to monitor, like as they were doing it, it shows up. And so I got to see, when are students working? What are the kinds of connections? Do I see similar connections that people are making? Or there's similar kinds of maps? And right now it looks like a mess, but at the time I could kind of see what were the things that they were prioritizing. And it was a way for me to be able to see the different kinds of activity that was taking place as they were doing their small groups without like jumping in and interfering. Lastly, I recommend also, I did this at times, was having different group roles can be useful. Having somebody monitor the chat, having somebody check for equitable participation, having somebody do the Jamboard or the whiteboard as something that we can share afterwards has been really a nice, useful way to make sure everybody is involved. And then my last point is, I also didn't care if they went off topic, and told them that sometimes, because it's been a really isolating time for the pandemic. So I don't want them to spend 20 minutes off topic, but if there's times when they're doing some community building, I felt that was really important for the class. and for them to start to build some relationships that they would get during breaks or that they would get before and after class, or even during the small groups in class, they would get to know one another. And so I made it clear, like if they were off topic and I came in the breakout room, I told them that it was okay and I'm glad. And what did you talk about? You know, like it wasn't something that they had to feel like wrong for doing. So I think that's my time, but I just want, those were some of the big ideas that I feel like I learned with my students this semester.
Yeah.